afternoon. Welcome to our February meeting of the Germans from Russia, Oregon, and Washington, chapter of the Germans from Russia Heritage Society. My name is Sharon Bell, and I'm secretary for the chapter. Our February meeting was going to be food demonstrations, but when Mother Nature dumped 11 inches of snow on us last week and is threatening more this week, we decided to cancel the in-person meeting. Instead, I will talk a bit and then demonstrate a couple of German-Russian recipes from my home. When I think about the history of German-Russian food, I think about how much more work putting food on the table was during my mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother's childhoods. Today, I go to the grocery store to buy my food ingredients. But back in my great-grandmother Christina Schlickenmeyer's day, as a child in Lichtenfeld, South Russia, her mother would send her or one of her siblings into the root cellar to bring up sausage the family made in the fall, and the potatoes and onions they harvested and stored. A trip to the community well for water for washing and cooking was another chore to be done. The fuel gathered and right type of fire would all need to happen before a meal could be made. My grandmother, Ruth Schatz, grew up on a central North Dakota homestead. Coal and gathered dried cow patties were some of the fuels they used there. Water was drawn from the nearby well. Many food items were grown and preserved, and those items that weren't grown could be bought at the country store 10 miles away in Pickardville. A long trip by horse and wagon. My great-aunt Susie writes in her memory cookbook, pies and kuchen were made with dried apples, apricots, or raisins, since they were cheap and always available at our country store. Having no cash, we would trade our cream and eggs for sugar, coffee, or whatever else we didn't grow. Sometimes we had to charge commodities. My mother, Catherine Long, grew up on a small farm in Clatskanie, Oregon, where they cooked on a wood stove. They had no running water inside and no electricity when they first moved there. How very different from my childhood, where we had a refrigerator, running cold and hot water, and an electric stove. We did have a basement where we kept the home canned goods. After dark, I didn't like going down the open stairs lit with one dim light bulb, and then through the dark basement to the fruit room near the roaring furnace to fetch a jar of canned cherries or pears. How easy it is now for me to open my freezer, grab some meat, use the microwave to defrost it, turn on the faucet to put water in the pot, and turn on the stove to cook my food. And if I'm missing an ingredient, it is only a short trip to the store to get whatever I need. In 1972, my great-aunt Susie dictated recipes from memory while my grandma Ruth hand-wrote them. In 1996, my mother Catherine transcribed these recipes. One of my favorite German-Russian recipes is kuchen. This recipe makes 4 to 5 and calls for a dough made with 1 package of dry yeast, 1 cup warm water or milk, 1/2 cup butter, 1 teaspoon salt, 1/2 cup sugar, 2 slightly beaten eggs, and 4 cups flour. For myself, I cut it in half to only make 2 kuchen, since it's just my husband and I at home here. Soak yeast in warm water, add sugar, flour, salt, and butter. Knead until firm or not sticky. Let rise, knead again. Cut dried apricots in half and soak in warm water to soften. If using fresh, just cut in half. After second dough rising, split dough into portions that will roll into 1/2 inch thick and fit a pie pan. Put rolled dough into greased and floured pie pan using fingers to spread 1/2 inch to 1 inch up the sides. Prick a fork and then let rise a little. So I've done that part already. We have our 2 kuchen doughs that I made, and we have the reconstituted dried apricots. So now I'm going to put those into the pan, and I usually like to put the cut side down. And meanwhile, my oven is preheated to 350 degrees. These apricots may look funny. I like buying the organic Turkish apricots because I don't like the sulfur in a lot of the dried fruit that makes it keep its yellow color. So that's why they're brown. All right, after filling with the fruit, the custard I pre-made, it's for the full recipe is 6 eggs, 1½ tablespoons flour, 3 cups cream or half and half, 1½ cups of sugar, and 1½ teaspoons vanilla. And like with the dough, I cut that in half. Mix with a wire whisk and then cook in a double boiler, stirring constantly, scraping the bottom until it begins to thicken. If you don't scrape the bottom, it can scorch, so that's why it's a constant stirring that's required. Pour over the top of the kuchen, sprinkle sugar and cinnamon on top, and bake in a 350-degree oven for 20 to 30 minutes. So this is my custard that I thickened in the double boiler on the stove. Looks like I have leftovers. Okay, so I'm going to put these in the oven and we'll cook them. Okay. Set for 20 minutes and I'll check on them. So my Aunt Susie in her cookbook said that her ma used to bake a wash tub of these on Saturday, and by Monday none were left. They had 10 to feed in their family. So next I'm going to talk about some recipes. Our Germans from Russia Family Heritage Recipe Book. And these are available for $12.50. So when I read about some of the Germans' Russian recipes in a Grove Family Heritage Recipe Book, I realize that some recipes were convenient. And by that I mean whatever was easy for tasks scheduled for the day, as in Arlene Dexheimer Maston's wash day dinner recipe, or based on what food, fresh or put up, was available. An example of this is Joanne Fow's refrigerator pickles recipe. When the cucumbers were ready, it was time for canning. Reading the stories behind our members' recipes is something I enjoy doing while I'm looking for a recipe to try. These two stories are great examples of descriptions that allow me to feel like I'm there. Arlene's wash day dinner story is as follows. This recipe survived after decades of my grandmother and then my mother preparing it on the day the family laundry was done. 2 large boilers of hot water occupied the top of the wood stove, which left no room for cooking. This dish was prepared very early in the morning and left to cook slowly on the back of the stove or in the oven. At the end of the day, everyone could sit down to a hot meal. This often included the neighborhood kids who knew what the menu would be and were enticed by the aroma. Her recipe is made in an lidded roaster of layers of diced red potatoes, finely diced onions, chunked bologna, or cut up all beef ballpark franks, and canned diced tomatoes, seasoned with salt and pepper and cooked at 325 degrees for about 2 hours. Joanne's pickle recipe is accompanied by this story, which I think many of us can relate to. Growing up, the garden was always a central point of our summers. We canned as much as we could, especially pickles. My favorite was any jar that didn't seal and we could eat them right away when they were just barely pickled. After our chores were done, my best friend and I would take a salt shaker, go to the garden, and pick whatever was ready. We would put the tomatoes, cucumbers, carrots, peas, or radishes into a bag and head out for our adventures for the day. Now that's what I call fast food. I didn't have any cucumbers to use, but I did make some refrigerator pickled onions using Joanne's recipe. The brine recipe uses salt, sugar, vinegar, celery seed, and dillweed, and it is tasty. And here's my pickled red onions using her recipe. Very sweet, but very good. Well, I could open a can of soup myself, put it in a bowl, pop it into the microwave, and have a hot meal in 5 minutes. A recipe like Netflix soup might take a little longer, but tastes oh so much better. My great aunt also included this recipe in her memory book. She calls it Aunt Lizzie's Worst Soup, but the best. This recipe was in the newsletter that was sent out to our members a couple of weeks ago. There are 3 other Netflix soup recipes in our Grow cookbook you could also try. So my broth is heating up on the stove, which I'm going to turn up so it will start boiling. And then I'm going to add some sliced German sausage. And I got these from Gartner's on Lombard and 75th in Northeast Portland. Next, I'll put in the diced potatoes. I need to drain them though. And then I like having carrots and celery, so I have some sliced carrots and some diced celery. And even though my broth has already got some seasoning in it, I'm putting a little more, some crushed black peppercorns and some fennel. And I think some celery seed too. Looks like my pot's a little full. And then, of course, there's the browned onions. I think I'm going to siphon off some of that water so it isn't too full. Pardon me. So while that's cooking, I will make the nepla. And since it's just my husband and me eating, I'm making a quarter of the recipe that my aunt used. So it's 1 cup flour, and then 1/4 teaspoon baking powder, and then 1/4 teaspoon salt, whisk together, and a well made in the center of it. And we need a egg, slightly beaten, and then enough water to make a dough that's soft but not sticky. So we'll see how we come out. For me, I always either have to add more water or more flour. I never come out even when I make these types of things. And I'm going to stand up here so you won't see my head, but you'll see my hands. We need to knead this dough. It's sticky. So I'm going to add some more flour. Might need even more flour. A little sticky. So once everything's incorporated, I'm going to roll it into ropes about a 1/2 inch in diameter and let them set for a little bit before we put them into the soup. For the soup, if you want them done at the right time, you wait until the potatoes are almost done before you put the nepla in there. And some people, instead of making soup, will make nepla, boil it in the water, and then drain it, and then fry it in the frying pan with onions and bacon grease. So I'm going to roll these out into ropes. sticky, but that's okay. I think someone had a recipe and they said that somebody complained that, I guess it was their mother's husband complained that they were like bullets. So they do have a, you know, a chew to them, and they're not fluffy biscuit type things, but I like them. So I'm going to let these sit here for a few minutes. I think I'll show some family pictures while we wait. This is a picture of my grandma Ruth Schatz and her sister Sue Schatz, taken on the North Dakota prairie in about 1918. This photo, taken around 1950, is of my mother's family. She's on the far left with her younger brother John, the twins Frank and Dorothy, and their mother Ruth in the truck. It was taken near Clatskanie, Oregon, on their small farm. Here is my great-grandmother Christina Schlickenmeyer Schatz, standing in front of her house on the homestead around 1961. In 1961, my parents and older sister visited family on the North Dakota homestead. On the left is my great-grandmother Christina, then my grandmother Ruth, and great-uncles Hank and Ed, who by this time were farming the homestead. My mother is seated with my older sister. Here at Crater Lake, Oregon, is my great-aunt Sue and my grandma Ruth, who is holding me in about 1963. In 1968, we were living in Portland when a big snowstorm struck. Here's my brother, my older sister, and myself next to a snowman that we made. Since we let them sit a little bit, I'm going to cut them into the soup. I turned down my temperature a little bit so it's not a rolling boil. And what will happen is these will sink when they first go in, but then they'll float when they're done. So I'm just going to snip bits into the soup. I think Aunt Susie says that to clip off about a third of the size of the thumb. I don't know what that means. A third of the width, a third of a knuckle, or a third of the whole thing. So I just cut them however they cut. Some of them are starting to float. This is good for leftovers too. And you can eliminate the sausage if you just want a soup without meat in it. But with that you might want to make sure your broth has a lot of flavor to it, because the sausage does add some good flavor. And usually I would do this in a bigger pot, but with two of us, we don't need a big pot full of soup. Okay, so that's cooking. Guess I should check to see how the potatoes are doing in there. Yep, they're getting soft. It looks like the kuchen's almost, timer's almost done. I don't know how they are. Yeah, they probably need to go a little bit longer, so it said 20 to 30 minutes. I'll show a close-up of these Nepla. There's some soup for you. Nepla soup. I'm sorry you couldn't sample the food, but I hope you enjoyed the program, and thanks for watching. We look forward to gathering in person for our March 26, 2023 meeting. And so again, thanks for tuning in. Here are some pictures of how the food turned out. Kuchen out of the oven. A big slice of kuchen. The Nepla soup that I made. As you can see, the pot doesn't have much in it. I was already eating some by the time I took this photo. Here is a close-up of my soup bowl. As you can see, there's not much left here either. Here is a cut Nepla showing the texture